Decolonising and Indigenising Spaces to Increase Engagement. Please welcome Dr. Kirsten Thorpe.
Thanks everyone, it is a long way up them stairs. I'm so thrilled to be here. I think after COVID, I know Sammy talked this morning about the importance of connecting with people, so it's been so great to just have the morning tea and to meet a few of you. So thanks to the organisers for having me along. I'm just recovering from COVID, so I'm hoping that I can sort of keep my energy going for the next hour, but if you see me dipping, I'm still here with you. So I'm just going to get the slides up. So yeah, big topic. I think I have you just before lunch too, so hopefully the sugar levels that you have keep you interested in this topic that I think for some is one that might be challenging, but for others I know that a lot of people are excited to start to think about what it means in your library setting. So I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, that I'm going to practice my pronunciations, the Tarabuleng, Bunda, Garang, and Bayali peoples. I watched some of the videos on the Bundaberg Council site this morning, and the one in particular from the Water Week animation last year, and as I flew in yesterday seeing the waterways, it really reminded me always of the care that community have had over land and waters. So I want to acknowledge community and people's ancestors. Thanks also to Uncle Mick for the welcome today and for those that joined on stage. I think it's so important that we take that message that Uncle Mick was talking about, that we're in this together. And as part of that, I really want to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present in the room. So a little bit about me. I guess it's always important when you talk about topics like this to place yourself. My mum's side of the family are Warramai from Port Stephens, so really good oysters, I always like to say, and seafood. For those of you that have ever travelled to Port Stephens, a couple of hours north of Sydney, just above Newcastle. I grew up on the land of the Wanneroo people in Singleton, in the Hunter Valley, and I live in Sydney on Gadigal land, and I work on Gadigal land, and I live on Darkinjung country. I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, and I'm a sister and an auntie, and I take all of that with me in the work that I do. So as Stephen mentioned, I'm a researcher at Jumbunna Research at UTS, so in at Broadway in Sydney, and I'm really fortunate to lead a team of researchers who I guess we're trying to look at, what's happening across GLAM spaces in an Indigenous context. I think libraries and archives for me are sort of at the heart of what we do, but we also are looking at the work of galleries and museums, and always like to mention when we're talking about that we really do take a very deep view in terms of Indigenous knowledge as being in all of those places. So sometimes when I use the terms libraries, archives, galleries, museums, at the core of that, thinking about the knowledge that has been transmitted and held by community and where that's ended up in those multiple places. I've trained as an archivist. After the Bring Them Home report, I was really fortunate to have a cadetship at the State Archives of New South Wales, working there to increase access to records of the former Protection and Welfare Board. So I think from the earliest time that I entered the profession, I had a really acute understanding of the power of information, what it meant for people to have access, and what it meant for people when they accessed material that was damaging. So some of those themes are going to come through my talk today as well. I feel very fortunate that I was able to help particularly stolen generation survivors access that content. And my driver, I guess, is to talk about this issue of representation and to start to get people thinking critically about, who created the information, where did it come from, who had a part in that. Because I think in my experiences of studying across archives, library, information management, knowledge management, I didn't have the opportunity at that time to have that critical view. And I know, thanks for the papers, with Sammy this morning and Gabby, your paper really highlighted a moment ago that critical view of how do we take that lens and start to think about things in a different way. So in terms of my experience as well, I've worked across the major collecting institutions, state archives. I used to do a lot of work going out to public libraries, and I really love being at public library conferences because you can see that embedded work that you're all doing. It's so valuable to connecting with communities. So although, my last period of working in practice was at the State Library of New South Wales, as much as I can, I would get out and visit communities. But for me, I guess some of the things I'm sharing today is also about a deep frustration that I saw in practice, that there's so much goodwill in the sector, and it often rests on people. It rests on, leaders being in particular moments and making change. And if that leadership would go, then often that commitment would move on. So I think professional discussions are so important because we start to think deeply about our values. But I'm also really interested in how our practice relates to theory. And, what are we taught when we go to library school, or, whether it's library technicians or through to postgrad studies. So I'm going to share a little bit of that as well. I was so heartened to hear and to read on the Bundaberg Council recognition of something that I always start my talks with, thinking, particularly when we're talking about decolonisation, is this reminder. This is the Redfern, a mural in Redfern, and just that message of, we're on a land that is so ancient, homes to thousands of generations of Indigenous men and women. And what I want to get you thinking about today is whether your library and the way it collects material, the way it represents Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, does it recognise this long history? And if it doesn't, what can you do about that? And it's something every time I walk into a public library that I have my eye looking over those forms of representation. And I know for other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that work in libraries, it's sort of it's a quick check around when you go in, whether it's from the welcome sign in the beginning, the use of language, but through to the way that collections are placed. It's a really important measure. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about three main themes. And I think before sort of talking about decolonising libraries, the different I see as effort around indigenising libraries. I guess I thought about that evoke theme a lot before coming here. And to me, it's all about spirit and intention. And I think the library profession as a whole and people who work in libraries have such a commitment to public good. And there is so much goodwill that exists. So the next step for me is moving beyond that into real action. And what I want to finish up with is a little bit of a discussion on what I would consider a crisis currently in terms of support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment in the sector, and get you thinking about that and whether you can contribute to that change that needs to happen. So I always try and make slides that aren't messy. I just went away to a conference overseas and I tried to pack the smallest bag that I could, and I realised that I'm not a small bag person. I had to take the big bag, and I think my slides as well, I was trying to have more pictures, but there's a lot of words on some of them. There's quotes from people. I don't expect you to read everything, but I want to share some of the thinking around decolonisation as well, because it is a buzzword. I want to try and unpack that a little bit for people, and I hope there's some things there that you can take up in reading. So, decolonising libraries. I just finished my PhD at Monash this year, and one of the findings was that decolonisation isn't quite possible in our sector. However, we can look at ways to have decolonial approaches. But if we start with, this idea of decolonisation, I think that we have to start with the colonial process. So the year 2020, we all know, marked the 25th anniversary of Captain James Cook sailing the Endeavour to, in quotes, discover Australia, a land that in 1770 had been occupied for millennia by a multitude of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and First Peoples. 18 years later, the first fleet arrived in Australia to a land at which time had been described as terra nullius, a land belonging to no one. This in itself was the act that denied the recognition of the sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over their lands and waters. Our major collecting institutions across GLAM played a role in the colonisation of Australia. The books and records published, created and kept often described Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as inferior and less than human. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices were rarely heard or visible in these collections, and they documented people as objects of study and curiosity. Indigenous scholars, including Irene Watson, often refer to the idea of the colonial project. So this quote from Watson says, "The colonial project is ultimately about justifying the occupation and exploitation of Indigenous land and the maintenance of unequal relationships between what she terms non-native and native. It is of paramount importance that the colonised remain contained as objects of the colonial state, and for the Indigenous, the only trajectory is to become totally absorbed and assimilated into the state." And in bold, that's my emphasis, Watson argues that the colonial project has embodied a centuries-long ongoing campaign to annihilate, define, subordinate and exclude the native, in inverted commas, and an arsenal of tools has been applied to these ends. So I guess at the top as well is some of the things that I want to get you thinking about is how have libraries and archives in Australia contributed to this colonial project? And I guess a bigger question is that project still continuing? So what I often talk about is we can't look at decolonisation until we understand what colonisation is. I really like this definition that O'Dowd and Heckenberg described in an article in The Conversation. They say that colonisation is more than physical. It's also cultural, it's psychological in determining whose knowledge is privileged. In this, colonisation not only impacts the first generation colonised, but creates enduring issues. So therefore, decolonisation seeks to reverse and remedy this through direct action and listening to the voices of First Nation people. When I read that, I think it's it's a simple but so effective definition that explains both the impact, the effects that we know exist on further generations, and that work that we're all trying to do to rectify that. So in that way, Indigenous decolonial approaches support active resistance. And we can't see that as anything else. I think that, I've heard so many people have conversations about decolonisation and, trying to throw the words around and saying it makes people uncomfortable. And I think it has to. If it didn't make people uncomfortable, it wouldn't be decolonising. So it's an active resistance, and it's a move to transform and liberate colonial structures. And if we think back to the definition of Watson and we start to conceive libraries as being part of those colonial structures, our work now is to see what is this active resistance. So in the context of collecting, which will be a bit of focus for me today, it gives us opportunities to think about how collections have been formed within Western paradigms and how they can be contested and reframed. And we can only address decolonisation if we know how the features and forms of colonisation are perpetuated in our collecting practices And for me, this isn't in relation to the goodwill that people operate on. It's actually really deeply embedded in the systems and structures of how we operate. Linda Tuiwai-Smith, a Maori scholar who led a lot of work around decolonising research, also offers this really fantastic view of decolonisation and says that decolonisation, once viewed as a formal process of handing over the instruments of government, is now recognised as a long-term process involving the bureaucratic, cultural, linguistic, and psychological divesting of colonial power. Further, Smith views decolonial theory in her work as enabling a critique of the assumptions, motivations, and values informed by dominant Western research practices and their history with imperialism. And I think the nature of collecting and the nature of our libraries has been that that's sort of been the backbone of some of this dominant theorising. So all of this history as context has impacted how Indigenous people were able to represent themselves in community context, and a wave of successive government policies, as I mentioned before, in terms of the legislation that impacted communities through the various protection boards, stripped Indigenous people of their right to practice culture, language, and connections to land. The words of Mick Dodson from the Atsilone Protocols express some of the issues of silences and portrayal of Indigenous people in a library and information context. And in the protocols, Mick says, "It's my view that you need to look carefully at the way Aboriginal people are portrayed in libraries, and you need to reach out to Aboriginal people and show us that we're welcome to participate in an area which we're excluded from for a long time." I really strongly believe that libraries have a role in our current process of supporting truth-telling and the recognition of these histories. They also have a role in enabling Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to share their experiences and perspectives on history that in the past were not documented through an Indigenous voice. In essence, then, libraries are vital public institutions that can contribute to national truth-telling and reconciliation. So decolonisation for me means addressing systemic and structural issues in libraries. And as I said, some of the conversations are going to make people uncomfortable. Around the back at the Civica stand, there's copies of the One Thing publication that was recently done through Civica and Brendan Fitzgerald. And I was really fortunate to have an opportunity to contribute an article to that. And one of the questions that I asked in that publication was drawing on the poetry of Amberlyn Quay-Mulliner, who has written an amazing poetry book called Stolen Land. And in that book, Amberlyn asked the question, "You're on stolen land, what are you going to do about it?" So in the Civica article, I extended that question to ask all libraries to consider, your library is on stolen land, and what are you going to do about that? So the term cultural safety is used a lot in libraries and in GLAM contexts to talk about Indigenous engagement. And I recognise the work of national state libraries, State Library of Queensland included, since we're here in Queensland, in that really important work. And colleagues like Leslie Akers, who did some really hard yards going around and talking about cultural competency. And while I think there's a place for discussing cultural safety, I think we also need to start talking about core issues, and we need to speak as well about the harms and dangers of libraries and archives. And a part of this is talking about systemic bias and racism and the existence of the white blindfold. The quote from colleague Nathan Sentence, who some of you might know, he has a blog called The Archival Decolonist. It's from my doctoral research, where Nathan reflects on how cultural safety is often used as a term to soften discussions that need difficult conversation. And in that, Nathan says, "I think sometimes cultural safety can be a minimiser of what we're really talking about. Also, when we use the term cultural, I see white people's eyes glaze over as they think we're talking about airy-fairy concepts. For example, it's all to do with our spiritual relationships. we're really talking about. However, sometimes we're actually talking about white people and colonisation, and we're talking about racism. They are the things that we want to be safe from. And some of that would be in the world, would relate to our spiritual relationships and our spiritual and cultural elements. But a lot has to do with us wanting space where we're not affected by racism. The racism is not there and the violence is not there. We need to call out the colonial violence in these organisations. One of my sort of often repeated pet annoyances, and one that I call out, is seeing the Tyndale volume accessible as a reference book on public library shelves. And I don't think it's any fault of libraries that they have the publication, the Aboriginal Tribes of Australia, on open access, but I always question if any other demographic in the community had pictures that were taken by an anthropologist that were invasive, that document men and women without clothing would be on an open access shelf. And I know we were talking just before in the break around sort of the idea of censorship and trying to navigate this space around harm. And I think, you know, there are so many things that we can do better. And the Tyndale book, although it's very important as historical research, has a place in, you know, our national institutions, in academic libraries perhaps, but in terms of public libraries, you know, it would be my recommendation that that wasn't on the shelf for kids to use for their assignments. It's also worth quite a lot of money, so I often advocate for the sale of the Tyndale Journal, because you might be able to buy a stack of really amazing books from that. I did have a look this morning. I think it's up to like $1,500 or something for the volumes. And that's just one example of a publication. When you start to take that critical eye to your collection, that you start to think, well, what might be more appropriate? So some of the things that we're thinking about are these, you know, the importance of critical information literacy. And that really requires us to start thinking about the social and political context of information creation and how power shapes how information is both created, made accessible, and used. On the right is some links to an interview with Kerry Klim. Has anyone heard the interview or heard of Kerry's work at all with school libraries? A couple of people. I think it's a really important conversation, although the context is in a school library setting. There's so much from that particular conversation and from Kerry's work that we can all learn from. Kerry had a situation, for those of you who weren't aware, where one of her children went to the school library and brought home books for an assignment, and Kerry started to work with the kids on the assignment and was mortified at the content of the books. And Kerry, being someone who's really active on Twitter, brought the conversation out through social media and shared what is still accessible, a critique of those materials. It's really valuable work, but it also shows, you know, something that I want to talk about a little bit later, the idea of allyship, and Kerry going into the school library and actually working with the librarian to assess that material. And if you have a look at the spreadsheets that were done and the dialogue around that, when we talk about censorship, and you know, I know Sammy talked about it this morning as well, I think there are some things that are just so racist, offensive, and morally wrong that they don't have a place to be on the shelf. They are examples of things that we need to manage in a particular way. They show they show discussions that are no longer acceptable. So I'm not suggesting that they should be burned, although I think some of the ones that Kerry had examples of were pretty mortifying, as I said. But I think we need to open up the dialogue around these materials and actually have a sophisticated dialogue. And I know I was saying to Stephen that Dr. Alex Byrne, who is a former state librarian, and I have a lot of discussions around censorship, and the idea of banning books. And Alex's position is always, in terms of his work with IFLA, to start to promote the books that are the ones that people should be reading. And while I think that is so critical and where we should be going, the examples that Kerry shared, I felt really saddened when I read them. And when I read them in the context of thinking about the current rates of Aboriginal deaths in custody, the situation around child removal that we're currently looking at in communities, I just thought we have to do so much better. So I really encourage you to go and look at that. So I guess in saying that as well, one of the things that I'm trying to get people to focus on, and we're in our work thinking a lot about, is not the idea per se around cultural safety, because cultural safety has a lot of assumptions in it. It was brought from very deeply embedded contexts of Maori health workers and scholars, understanding that in a much more embedded community context. And we've brought it over to Australia in a multitude of ways, but we haven't actually done, I believe, the hard work to understand what cultural safety is. And so with the body, with healthcare, people, if you go into a doctor or a health service, you have control over your body and that healthcare service, and you can say particular things around your cultural safety. However, if we're talking about libraries, it's pretty hard to work out, well, what is a cultural safe library? And I think one of the things that I understood in my studies and doing my doctorate was what people were actually talking about a lot were those harms and dangers. They didn't want to see material that was racist. They didn't want to see material that represented their culture in a bad way. So rather than speaking the truth to that, they were saying, well, actually, I want to be culturally safe. So what I've been thinking about a lot more is this idea of, can we refocus instead to look at a more embedded view of health and well-being in terms of Indigenous social, emotional well-being, because it really starts to centre on ideas of connection to land, sea, culture, spirituality, family and community. That is the currency, and it's the important work that's happening in communities. And how can libraries engage with that as a concept rather than quite a risk-adverse view around safety? So I know that there's a lot more work that needs to happen with that, but I encourage all of you, if you're using that term cultural safety, to really start to think, well, when I'm saying that, what does that mean? And how is it being applied? So I think in light of that as well, coming back to the systemic and structural issues, I guess I wanted to highlight a couple of things that I could see as being decolonial approaches. So one of the things that talk about is the silencing of Indigenous people's sovereignties. So with our collections, with our library systems, with our collection development, with our library strategy and policy, with our spaces, whether it is that physical, emotional or spiritual connection, have community been embedded as partners to that work? Is there governance structures, or are there governance structures in place so that people can actually have input into decision making and do the really important work around collection bias? We were talking earlier about some things, consultation partnerships are thrown around as big ideas, but the idea of a participatory service, I think, is something we're talking about is really critical in that way. And if we go back to that sort of idea of terra nullius and we look at that map of Aboriginal Australia and looking at your library system, how do people connect with that? Is it through that view? Are we speaking to that long history, or is it through those Western paradigms that until you start to have that lens, you might not actually start to have that moment of, oh, okay, this is two different worldviews, perhaps clashing with each other. The idea of the white blindfold, I think, is something that we need to talk about more. Systemic bias, people talk about critical cataloguing, what do you do if material is offensive? People often talk about, well, it's of its history. Of course it is, but what's the work that we need to do to stop the harm that happens for people when they're coming in and accessing them collections? So what can we do around updating metadata, How do we enable a right of reply? How do we get communities who may have had information misrepresented? How do we enable an opportunity to give those people voice? And I think so much around that dominant settler voice, thinking about those long histories, getting people around the idea that things didn't start in 1788 and then look back to communities, but communities have been here for 60,000 years, and cultural continuity is part of everything that's going on. I wanted to point out, just in the last week, you can throw these ideas around of things that need to happen, but IATSIS have created this really great guide. I think it was only put out in the last 2 weeks, sort of extending the work of Kerry going into the school library and looking at education resources. And there was a document that was done in 2007 by the Queensland Studies Authority that starts to give people an assessment model to go and look at the publications that are in a school library and start to have that lens. So this has just come out. It's there as a framework, and it has a really good, in terms of the pyramid there, material created by mob, with mob, for mob, and then as we go down the bottom, about mob or against mob. So it's probably a really useful tool for people to have a look at. So I want to turn now to the idea of Indigenising libraries, which for me is a separate pursuit to decolonising. For me, this indigenising, and it's a tricky term, I think, in itself, recognising the diversity of communities and all that comes with local ways and understanding. But it is about cultural continuity, as I just mentioned, but it's also about thinking about Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And at the core of that, really, it's about library systems and processes that support Indigenous worldviews. And I know when Uncle Mick was up here this morning, I was thinking about, the view that's often expressed in a community context that our elders are our libraries. So how do we think about oral transmission? How do we think about not just the book as this pervasive form of information circulation, but what are the other ways that we bring literacy and understanding? And if we think about libraries that support cultural continuity and an indigenising framework, we're also linking back again to those ideas around social, emotional well-being. And core to those are ideas and concepts around Indigenous self-determination and agency and representation. So things aren't done as the IATSIS view had about us, but they're done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the idea of living libraries and living archives on country is all about this cultural continuity. And I think the relationships that exist between people, place, and information is critical. And I guess being in Queensland, I really want to recognise the work of the IKCs. It's such groundbreaking work, and sometimes I think even looking online, and for me being based in New South Wales, there are moments of great visibility, but then you start to see, I know that there's been an anniversary for any of you that work in there of, is it 30 years? Does anyone know of the IKCs operating? 20 years, 20, 25? Yeah. So it's such a hugely embedded project. And I guess I wonder, what can we learn about the IKCs and what other support do they need? What are the models that are happening in the IKCs that could be brought into more mainstream public library settings? So in terms of the indigenising approaches, there are a lot of protocols to help us guide this work. Can people raise their hand if they know about the ATSI protocols? Okay, so a couple of people. So the ATSI protocols, they were developed in 1995. They need updating, and there's a little bit of work happening at the moment to bring the membership group of ATSI. So ATSI, as an acronym, is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Library Information and Resource Network. And it was such a for the mid-1990s, such a foundational piece of work that I think happened in the Australian library sector to guide this dialogue around how to both work with our colonial history, but also look at the indigenising framework. So please go and read them. The website itself still looks like it is 1995, which is a bit of a blast from the past. I kind of like it when I go there. It's hosted by AATSIS, the Aboriginal Institute in Canberra. The quote from Mick Dodson was taken from the protocols, and there's a lot of representation of, particularly people that led the sector, before our time, before my time in this work. So it gives you the potential, I guess, to see that these aren't new issues. They're things that people have been contemplating for quite some time. It has a little bit in there about employment, which again I'll touch on later. But yeah, they are still a fantastic resource. And I also wanted to point out, I know that you've got the fabulous Dr. Terry Jenke here tomorrow. Terry's work is so foundational in terms of the retrospective consideration of ICIP, which stands for Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property. We can't indigenise libraries unless ICIP is core to what we do. So in all of our processes, we have to start to think about, particularly with things like language, are Indigenous people's rights being protected as we engage in that space? And, Terry's work just sets out an incredible framework for people to go and read and embed that in your workflows. And the other one I've got there on screen is the protocols that were just released by the University of Sydney Library. I think they've shaken up a bit of conversation around researcher engagement with things like historical thesis, but again, sort of have this moment to look back, but also forward in, if we want to stop the colonial approaches and we do want to indigenise, what are the new ways that we engage in this work? So before I turn to Indigenous employment, I thought I'd just run through a few examples of indigenising libraries. And I guess core for me is the sentiment around increasing Indigenous voices. So collecting materials created by Indigenous authors should be prioritised within your library collection. Again, the conversation around where the supply chain comes from is really critical in this, and that's why I always point to the systemic and structural issues. So if you aren't getting supplies from areas where you do have material created by First Nations people in your area or state, or more broadly nationally, how can you acquire that? Are there Indigenous publishers, or is there self-publishing that's happening locally that you can actually support people to tell their own stories? So that's a first. I think secondly, looking at the importance of language reclamation and maintenance. I know in New South Wales we've seen huge moves with the New South Wales Aboriginal Languages Trust being created so that communities can keep the important work of language reclamation happening, and libraries just have so much to offer to this space. And IFLA have statements online about how that work connects with things like the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And I think that when the year of Indigenous languages was launched in 2019, they realised there's so much work to do, so they had to make it a decade. So I encourage you to think about, is work happening in your community that you can support, that you can give visibility to? It's not just about those gestural things. I think it was said in the last paper, symbolism is one thing, and we have to start with symbolism, but there's a whole lot of work that I believe libraries can really get behind to help that maintenance effort in the future. The other thing that I wanted to mention is reconsidering classification and use of collections and spaces. So the great example that there's an article in the library journal and online of the Galawinku Community Library classification system. So I guess one of the things I always think about is where we sort of have this idea of what the norm is and the way we have to do things, but the rules can be broken. So if you want to engage community in a way that makes sense, then this is a really, really significant and important project that got community to say, well, this is how we would classify. And the Katoomba Library example on the right is a real gestural, but also I think a moment where, in terms of a tourist moment out of Sydney, people going up to the Blue Mountains, that there's a statement that's been made when you walk into that library of an Aboriginal knowledge collection when you walk in, and it's simply material being circulated, but there's a place, I think, when people first come in that says, the Blue Mountains have been here for, been occupied and cared for 60,000 years, and this is what we're going to do about it. So they don't have to be things that are, require a whole lot of resources, but at least the gesture is extended into something that continues. And another thing I just mentioned before I turn to employment is the Indigenous Spaces in Libraries, Places project that I worked on with myself and Monica Galassi and Marley Joseph, that I know is up here in Queensland now at the State Library of New South Wales. The work still continues there, but it really is a framework that people can go into and say, well, I don't know where to start in terms of my strategy to increase Indigenous participation in the library, but I can start at this piece and go on to the next. And I think really importantly for us when we built this strategy, and it was from 2015, it was also about celebrating success. So, not to have the assumption that people aren't doing things. I think people are doing amazing things, but often because it is busy work, that visibility isn't always out there and online. So really encouraging people to share that information. And I know in the last presentation, seeing the yarning place there, like how can we push this out to say this is what Australian libraries are doing, I think is really important. Okay. So we talked a little bit about decolonisation, thinking about, what would if you go into your library and you think, well, does the colonial project exist in my library? I think that's a really great thing to go back and start to think, is your library a tool in that process of denying sovereignty? And that's a really hard question, but, I'd love to hear from you if you do a staff exercise kind of looking at those lenses. Is the Aboriginal map, is it featured or embedded in ways that go beyond the signage? How is that represented when you go in? And in terms of indigenising, all the exciting work happening with communities, thinking about how you filter that through is so vital and worth celebrating and building upon. Some of these changes, they take decades, and I think Terry tomorrow, when she's talking about the roadmap and her work that she did with museums and galleries, it's a decadal plan. It's not, a 1 year, 2 year effort. We really need to see, systemic change happening. And I want to finish by talking about Indigenous employment in that context, because I think that we all need to take stock of where we're at in Australia and really start to think about what we can do from public libraries through to school libraries, national and state libraries, to support Indigenous employment. So probably one of the reasons that I want to finish with this as well is in my PhD studies, one of the things that I found is that a lot of the work that's happening at the sector at the moment is grounded, and it's being built through the energy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander library, archive, gallery, museum workers. And we need to both shine a light on that to say how incredible that people have been driving this, but we also need to look at things like cultural load. People talk about ideas like identity strain. So, you brought into the library as the library technician and people find out, I think Sammy talked about that earlier, you brought in to do a particular task and then your identity becomes a part of your work. So how do we create a workforce that encourages that diversity, but also starts to think about, well, what are the excellent things that Indigenous library workers bring to our sector, and how can we support that further? It's a real passion of mine because I came to my work in archives through a cadetship, and I think in the late 1990s, there was a lot of cadetships that were happening. There were a lot of traineeships that kind of got people into an area that they could kind of test. I like being in an information setting or a library, but we don't see as many of them opportunities existing anymore. So some of you may have seen, through the support of an ALIA research grant, I did a little bit of research through Jumbunna on a national survey of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment in Australian libraries. And I guess one of the aspirations of this was to look at self-identification of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander library workers, so not talking about librarians, library technicians, and doing the sort of classification, but thinking about people that were in the workforce in libraries, across national, state libraries, academic libraries, school libraries, and other special libraries. And through sort of the advice of an Indigenous advisory group, trying to reach out for people to self-identify, because ALIA, in their workforce diversity report and in other anecdotal information that they were publishing, was saying there's less than 100 Indigenous workers across Australian libraries. And I guess one of my views is we can't see where we're going unless we know where we're started, and that's really not visible at the moment. So it was a bit of an attempt to do that self-identification, how many people would complete the survey, but also built into the research some yarning sessions with people who wanted to be interviewed around workforce conditions, and I guess to get a little bit of a take on, well, what would, if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were talking about the library workforce that they were after, what would that look like? So as I said, lack of data, current rates. I think as a bit of a pilot study, the methodology probably needed to be improved, because there is that risk, who's going to self-identify. So 52 people responded to the survey for that. So it gave a good snapshot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers. And I interviewed 10 people as part of the data collection. So they're pretty sort of stark numbers. I don't know if that shocks other people in the room, but it was actually a really good opportunity for people to say, well, across the state, where is the most employment and in what kind of settings? The other thing that was sort of, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think in Australia, we're sort of doing this catch-up race with ourselves at the moment, and we're significantly behind other international library settings in terms of thinking about Indigenous librarianship, and I think we really need to start to focus on that. So by that, thinking about, well, what is the cultural work that Indigenous workers lead in the library sector in their various roles, but also, if we look internationally, particularly in academic libraries, what is the other roles that could come to be brought to bear from librarians actually taking on roles where they work with community? And we don't have that vibrancy. I think it's probably quite informal in Australia at the moment. So thinking about that was important in the research. And we have this whole other movement that's coming around Indigenous data sovereignty that, I think from the perspective of ALIA, in all the workforce, there's going to be demands that come to us as a workforce from that Indigenous data sovereignty movement that we need to be aware of. So there was a whole heap of recommendations from the report. I'm going to give the link in a minute to go and for you to see online. I think one of the really heartening things for me is that it was, in terms of getting together at conferences like this, there was so much of an expression of, what an amazing area to work in. We love libraries, so the opportunities were just vast. And what really came out in the interviews was how proud Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were about their work because it connected with community. That was sort of a driving force. But it also identified gaps, and some of those issues around cultural load, so looking at people's role descriptions, if they are employed in a library, are they also they're doing their job but also being pulled into the Reconciliation Action Working Group, and then, can you go out and talk to community, because they might be, you might have partnerships or relationships that can be extended, but doing double work and trying to bring some visibility around that. But there's opportunities for that because we can start to reconsider the role descriptions and understand that work to build relationships is a part of library work. It is in many different ways. So lots in the report, and one of the things that, so there's the link there, and just acknowledging as well that Alia helped support that through the grant, and people should apply for that if you see that advertised. But one of the really great things that came from that and is work in progress is the development of the first ALIA, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Expert Advisory Group. So colleagues, and I want to name everyone for their contribution, Leslie Akers, Rebecca Bateman, Renee Johnson, Yanti Ropeyan, Ryan Stoker, myself and Damien Webb have been meeting to look in partnership with ALIA around where are we at in terms of Indigenous priorities. I think as a group, we've all said one of the challenges is that I think ALIA, even as a national institution, has had peaks and troughs in terms of their support. So recognising that, what are the things that we need to do? In the same way, Terry will talk tomorrow about the museum and galleries roadmap. Where are we going and how do we get people on board with that? So that group in itself, we're just looking at strategy at the moment, and I guess I wanted to say for other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room, and if you have colleagues who aren't here or people that might watch online, I think that there will be ongoing work, and we really want other people to participate in this and contribute to that agenda. And one of the things that we have been working on that I know Kathy was here from ALIA talking about yesterday is the Professional Pathways project that ALIA have been involved with, and really trying to embed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and worldviews into that professional pathway framework so that there's recognition. And the group came up with some words around what that would look like, but it definitely needs others to go in and give feedback. So please find that. I think there's a survey online at the moment. If anyone's here from ALIA, they can share that. So, I guess some takeaways from me is, the approaches for decolonising and indigenising libraries are, I see, two different agendas. The decolonisation has to be around, starting to strip away that past of people being silenced, people being invisible in that process. And thinking again, if they're really harsh words, an arsenal of tools, but if you go into your library and start to think about that, give yourself an opportunity. There's a lot of reading online around, how colonisation is perpetuated. Start to get embedded and think about that in your work. And think about how that is just normalised in your practice. If you look at that map again of Aboriginal Australia, does that sing through in your systems or your policies? Where does that fit in terms of that recognising that long history? Really encourage you in terms of the decolonisation to think about the harms of your library. If there are things that are harmful, try and do something about it. It doesn't mean burning books out the back or STEM being censored, but find a measured way, have dialogue about it. That's what I think is so important, and I always sort of recognise Dr. Alex Byrne in the conversations that we've had. Just to share an example at the State Library, I know we've got time. Have we got time? Yeah. When the State Library of New South Wales was digitising a lot of images, so government funding had been made available, and there was a lot of material that was coming to the fore that hadn't been seen before, and we were alerted to the fact that there was material that had been digitised that documented the Aboriginal remains being stolen from graves, and the images were really shocking because the people who were exhuming ancestors' remains were posing as they were doing that work. And so we had a big discussion around what's the right for this to be online? How do we navigate this? And Alex was saying, well, Australians need to know that this happened and that ancestors' remains were sent overseas, they were sent for further study. And so our dialogue was around, well, who benefits from that access? And what's the harm to community if that was their ancestors? Also to the families who were involved in the acts, what's the dialogue that needs to happen with them? And I think in that situation, we actually decided that it would be removed from public access, but the metadata would be made available. So it was just kind of, I guess, a bit of a gateway and a protocol around that. But I think for me, the discussions were so invaluable because it isn't the quick response to shut things down, but it's actually us, as Uncle Mick said, getting on board and being a part of this together. So my last two things again was thinking about, really transforming our library landscape. The IKC model should be a part of every public library approach. Thinking about, elders as our libraries, having that real participation. And I guess I want people to go away and think about if you're in a leadership role or you have capacity to make change and you control the resources, to start to think about Indigenous employment, because we really need to see an increase of people coming into the profession and being sustained in leadership roles. So I'll finish with this one. It's a great t-shirt, good intentions are not enough. And I love this quote from one of the participants from the research, saying, I think having Aboriginal people in this sector and being seen, being reflected, both in the wider community and especially amongst mob over Australia, can really play a role in showing that this is something that they can do. Traditionally, libraries have been looked on as very Anglo institutions. So thanks, everyone.
That was absolutely phenomenal. We have a lot to think about in regards to what Dr. Kirsten Thorpe has just said. So can we go to questions? Anyone with a question?
At the moment, our colleagues at UTS we're doing a little bit of sort of scanning around, the national thesauri, and I think IATSIS have the gateway, they have the language, and so Auslang is being updated all the time in that thesauri, but the subject thesaurus, although I think it was, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was approved as the Library of Congress standard, I don't think it's being updated. So I think there's work with ALIA and other peak bodies to say, well, how do we pick this back up? I recognise, people ask us that all the time, how do we do this well? And I think what we're seeing is that there's a whole heap of style guides being, I know at University of Technology in Sydney, we've got style guides around appropriate language that are really useful, but they don't go back in, they don't mesh in with that. So probably my answer is at the moment, we have to advocate for that to happen. And what we've been talking about is how exciting would it be if, we could create a resource that fed local kind of understandings into a national framework, but it's yet to happen. Yeah.
So much. We're doing a lot of work and we'll be working with ALIA and the advisory group as well around collection description and subject topics. So follow us on our link on the ALIA website, and if you have any questions or queries, please do get in touch. We'll be able to hopefully make some traction in this space. Thank you.
And I think the only other thing to add to that is we've been having lots of conversations around, contestation and the idea that if it gets to the point that people say they have differing opinions, that as a sector we have to enable that, because if we go for consensus all the time and the discussions, First Nations, First People, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, we miss the really important point of what we're doing. So I think in any of that resource description we have to enable an opportunity for that dialogue to happen in a way that people can represent themselves in the way that they wish. And that's going to be hard.
Okay, was there another question? I think there was...
Sorry.
Any more more questions? Was there one up the back? I thought I saw a hand. No.
Gonna eat lunch.
We can indeed. Well, again, thank you so much, Kirsten. That was wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. So before we hear from our sponsor, Peter Powell, just a few reminders. Let's get around and visit those vendors, get those trade passports filled in, check out our poster